It was a muggy July evening in Bowling Green, Kentucky, the kind of suffocating southern heat that made the air taste of asphalt and rain that never fell. Emily Carter trudged barefoot across her small front yard, the grass sharp and scratchy against her heels as fireflies blinked lazily in the settling dusk. The screen door creaked behind her as she glanced back once at her mother in the kitchen window, her silhouette framed by the hum of yellow light. Emily was 14, restless and unbothered, sent on a small errand to borrow sugar from the Perrys, 2 houses down on Shive Lane. The street was quiet, except for the whirr of cicadas, and Emily carried no fear in her chest. She walked in slow, swinging steps, savoring the sense of being old enough to run these neighborly chores alone, breathing in the mix of honeysuckle and car exhaust that always seemed to hang over their block. It felt like just another Kentucky evening that would never change. The Perry house squatted near the curve of Shive Lane, its peeling siding a dull gray blue that always looked damp no matter the weather. Emily paused at the cracked walkway, lined with weedy azaleas, scuffing her flip-flops in the dirt, as she thought of what to say. She had been here before plenty of times for school fundraisers and neighborly greetings, but she always felt watched. The porch light flickered insects orbiting its glow in slow, drunken spirals. She climbed the steps and rapped on the wooden door, smiling politely, even before it opened. The whole neighborhood was used to casual drop-bys, but tonight the silence felt thick. She glanced at the curtains in the front window, stiff and closed, catching the faintest movement inside a shifting of shadows behind warped glass. Emily adjusted the hem of her sun-faded t-shirt and shifted the weight of her feet, waiting for that familiar click of the knob turning. But nothing came. The door remained shut, the shadows frozen. Emily's smile faded as she tilted her head, listening, hearing only the sough drip of a leaking gutter somewhere above her. She knocked again more insistently and shifted her weight impatiently. The silence grew heavier. She glanced back down the street toward her own house, where the kitchen light still burned bright, imagining her mother stirring batter and glancing at the clock, waiting for the sugar that would make her cake rise properly. A car door slammed somewhere far off the sound, carrying easily in the humid air, making her flinch just slightly. She rubbed her arm, feeling a trickle of sweat run along her elbow. Still no answer. A flicker of annoyance crossed her face, but she held her ground, determined not to return empty-handed, certain the neighbors would eventually open up. She was sure she saw the curtain twitch again just for a second. In the Carter kitchen, Janice glanced at the clock again. The old digital numbers glowed 7:19 p.m. She wiped flour from her hands onto a dish towel brow creasing with mild irritation. She was no worrier by nature, but Emily should have been back by now. She leaned over the sink to peer out the window. The Perry house was partly visible between the hedges, its porch dark except for the dying yellow bulb that stuttered on and off. Janice sighed and picked up the old wall phone, dialing the number she knew by heart. The ringtone trilled hollowly in her ear. After several rings, the line clicked alive, with a rough, impatient voice that seemed surprised to answer. Janice cleared her throat, trying to keep her tone pleasant and neighborly, as she asked if Emily was still there. The voice hesitated, then said no. Claimed no one had knocked, that no one had come by? The words rang flat in the quiet kitchen, and for a moment Janice said nothing at all. She lowered the receiver slowly, letting the dial tone hum in the background before setting it back in its cradle. Her hands were shaking slightly, flour dusting the countertop like pale fingerprints. She wiped them on her jeans, breathing through the sudden sense of wrongness that lodged in her chest. Outside, the sun had begun its slow crawl below the horizon, leaving the world striped in long shadows that seemed to move even as she stared. She stepped to the back door and called out into the yard, her voice cracked with forced casualness, calling Emily's name twice. No answer came back, just the dull drone of the cicadas and the far-off barking of someone's dog. The yard felt too big, too empty. She pressed a hand to her chest, her heartbeat unsteady, and turned back inside to grab her keys. By the time she stepped onto Shive Lane, the street felt changed like a stage after the lights went out. She walked quickly, squinting through the gloom toward the Perry house. The porch light glowed weakly, insects crawling all over it in frantic patterns. The walkway was empty. No, Emily sat on the steps, sulking or playing with her hair the way she might, if she were bored of waiting. Janice's breath came faster as she hurried up the path, pausing to call out for her daughter, in a voice that cracked, despite her best efforts. She pounded on the door with her fist harder than Emily ever had. She thought she heard movement inside, but the door stayed shut. She stood there, a long moment, fists clenched at her sides, her eyes stinging in the humid air, listening to nothing but the settling of the old house and her own panicked breathing. Finally, she turned away, feet scuffing down the path, as she noticed something pale in the weeds near the driveway. She bent to pick it up, her fingers trembling. It was Emily's left flip-flop, worn and dusty, the small plastic flower on the strap half broken. She swallowed against the rising panic, scanning the yard, with eyes that barely registered the growing darkness. She found the other flip-flop tossed under the low branches of a bush, its strap torn loose. Drag marks cut through the thin layer of gravel toward the side yard, but ended abruptly where weeds choked the ground. Janice knelt there, hands shaking mind, refusing to accept what her eyes saw. She shouted Emily's name into the encroaching night, until her throat hurt, but there was no answer. The world felt like it had shrunk to just her 2 shoes and the sound of her own ragged breathing. She turned back toward her house now, just a square of light in the deepening gloom. Her legs felt heavy, every step a fight against the sick realization settling in her stomach. She knew this street, these neighbors, every creak of every house. She had lived here for 15 years. She had sent her daughter 2 doors down, expecting safety. She walked faster, nearly tripping over the uneven sidewalk. As she reached her front door, she turned one last time, staring at the Perry house. The porch was empty. The curtains were drawn tight. That flickering bulb above the door cast an unsteady glow that seemed to pulse in time with her racing heart. And then it went out completely, plunging the house into darkness, as if it had never been there at all. The summer night deepened as Janice's voice cracked from calling her daughter's name into the darkening street, but neighbors began to notice her panic. Porch lights clicked on one by one, and soon the small community buzzed with movement as people stepped out in slippers or work boots, blinking in confusion that turned quickly to worry. An older man from 2 doors down carried a flashlight with a weak yellow beam, sweeping it across hedges and driveways, as Janice explained in gasps that Emily had gone to the Perry house and never come back. Voices overlapped in anxious debate, but eventually someone called the sheriff's office. The operator's voice on the other end tried to keep calm, as Janice clutched the phone so hard her knuckles whitened, her chest heaving with the terror of admitting her daughter was missing. Within the hour, red and blue lights reflected off windows and cars lined the narrow street as uniformed officers began to question the gathering crowd. The deputies walked stiffly up to the Perry house, their boots crunching gravel as they rapped hard on the door. Light flickered behind drawn curtains, and eventually the door creaked open to reveal Mrs. Perry's thin frame. Her hair was tied back in a severe knot, and she peered at the deputies with narrow eyes, confusion giving way to irritation. She denied ever seeing Emily that evening, said the doorbell must have malfunctioned, or that Emily must have gotten tired of waiting and wandered off. The officers insisted on a walk through their flashlights, cutting cones of pale light through stale, close air that smelled of damp and old paint. They checked the tidy living room and a shadowy hall that ended at the kitchen, but their interest sharpened when the canine unit sniffed along the linoleum floor, tail high and tense. When they reached the basement door, the dog scratched insistently at the cracked paint, whining in short, urgent bursts as the handler tugged its collar. Inside the basement, the air turned sour with mildew. Boxes lined one wall, stacked sloppily, but dry despite the musty scent. Exposed joists showed decades of repairs with fresh lumber in one corner that seemed out of place. The dog circled tightly, nose pressed low, emitting a single bark that echoed in the cement-walled space before stopping to sniff at a seam where the floor met the wall. The handler noted it, exchanged a brief look with the deputy, but Mrs. Perry scolded them for tracking dirt on her stairs and urged them to leave if they had no warrant. She pointed out they had no right to keep searching her private home, no matter what the neighbors whispered, and the deputy's polite language hardened as he insisted they had reason to investigate. In the end, though, with no warrant and no visible evidence of wrongdoing, they left the basement behind the dog, growling softly as it was led away. Back outside, Janice demanded answers, her voice raw and strained as she pressed the deputy for what they had found. He shook his head with a grim frown, explaining the scent had been tracked inside, but disappeared near the basement, which suggested Emily had been there at some point. But they could not confirm anything more. The neighborhood pulsed with gossip, as word spread that the Perry house had been the last place Emily was seen, that the police had found something, but refused to say what. More volunteers joined in, and by the time dawn broke across a pale Kentucky sky, the entire street seemed to buzz with restless urgency, with people gathering in knots to plan a more thorough search of yards, woods, and drainage ditches nearby. Deputies drew up grids on lined paper, handing them out to volunteers with old maps that showed drainage canals and vacant lots where tall grass grew chest-high. Retirees walked shoulder to shoulder with teenagers still wearing sandals, beating the grass with sticks to flush out any sign of Emily. A local church offered its hall for volunteers to rest and coordinate, while the sheriff's department parked cruisers at both ends of Shive Lane to block unnecessary traffic. Dogs sniffed along the tree line, pausing at every pile of brush or caved-in shed. But by midday, the only things they found were rabbit holes and wind-blown garbage. Helicopters buzzed overhead at intervals, their blades beating out a low thunder that made the dogs bark and sent pigeons fluttering in panicked clouds. By evening, the searchers grew exhausted, their shirts streaked with sweat, and Kentucky clay, their eyes rimmed with red from crying or dust. Janice sat on the front steps of her house with her head in her hands, refusing food or water, barely acknowledging the neighbor who draped a quilt over her shoulders. She had not slept since Emily disappeared, her mind stuck in an endless loop of self-blame and dread. The sheriff tried to assure her they would not stop looking, that they were interviewing anyone who might have seen something. But the words sounded hollow, even to him. As dusk fell for the second time without Emily's return, the searchlights cut long beams through the humid dark, sweeping across yards where wind rustled through leaves that offered no answers at all. By the end of that second day, the entire county seemed to know about the girl who went missing after knocking on a neighbor's door. Local television trucks arrived with satellite dishes and lights that made the street glow like a movie set, capturing Janice's drawn face and the weary frustration of the sheriff's department. The Perrys closed their curtains tighter than ever, refusing to answer repeated knocks from reporters. Volunteers lingered for hours, even after the official search paused for the night, unwilling to admit defeat, but unable to see where else to look. In the dark, only the hum of generators and the crackle of police radios offered proof that the world was still moving forward at all, even as it felt like time had stopped entirely on Shive Lane. As weeks turned into months, the energy that had once galvanized the community faded into a resigned hush. The search parties thinned out as days passed with no clues and no sign of Emily. Posters plastered on telephone poles curled at the edges in the wet Kentucky summer, their bright colors fading to pale ghosts of her smiling face. Janice continued to patrol Shive Lane every evening, clutching a flashlight even when the batteries ran low, eyes darting to every rustle in the bushes and every shifting shadow. The neighbors grew wary of making eye contact, mumbling empty condolences when they passed her on their way to work. The investigation moved to binders and files stacked in the county office, gathering layers of dust as new crimes and emergencies demanded attention. Detectives rotated off the case, their notes clipped neatly, and filed away nothing but cold facts on yellowing paper, with no sense of resolution or hope. Janice refused to accept the slow death of the search. She gathered every scrap of evidence the police would share, pinning maps to her living room walls, with colorful tacks marking sidings and dead ends. She called the department weekly, demanding updates in a voice that was frayed and shaking, alternating between pleading and anger. The sheriff began avoiding her calls, instructing deputies to deliver polite but empty reassurances that they were doing all they could. Late at night, Janice would sit at her kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee, tapping her fingers restlessly and staring at Emily's school photo propped against the salt shaker. Her eyes were dry and red from nights with no sleep. She became the subject of whispered conversations at the grocery store and the post office people shaking their heads with a kind of pity that felt cruel, even when they meant it kindly. Strange things began to happen that only deepened Janice's paranoia. On more than one occasion, she noticed a dark gray van idling on Shive Lane after midnight, its headlights off engine rumbling low like a sleeping animal. She would press her face to the window, heart pounding, convinced someone sat behind the wheel watching her house. When she opened the door and stepped outside, the van would pull away, slowly, taillights glowing dull red as it turned out of sight. She reported these incidents to the sheriff, her voice rising in panic and rage, but they found nothing and advised her to lock her doors at night and call if she saw it again. She left the porch light on until dawn, but it offered little comfort. Investigators continued to pick at the case, trying to find something to break the stalemate. In the course of checking property records and vehicle sales, they discovered that Mr. Perry had sold his old Dodge Ram pickup barely 2 weeks after Emily's disappearance. Curious, they requested records from the dealership and found receipts showing the entire interior had been professionally steam-cleaned before the sale, removing stains and odors down to the upholstery foam. The deputy who reported this detail noted it grimly in his file, but admitted there was no law against selling a clean truck. They brought the Perrys in for questioning again, but the couple sat side by side in stiff-backed chairs, insisting they had nothing to hide. Their lawyer objected to every line of inquiry that seemed accusatory, threatening legal action if the department continued what he called harassment. By the end of the first year, the official stance on Emily's case hardened into an uncomfortable truth that no one wanted to speak out loud. There was no evidence to justify an arrest or even a formal search warrant for the Perry property. The basement, with its strange odor and rough repairs, remained unexamined, a dark pit of rumor and suspicion that no one could legally enter. The sheriff's department logged it as an open but inactive case, a missing person with no solid leads. The file sat on a shelf among dozens of others growing thicker, only with the occasional crank tip, or well-meaning but useless sighting from out of state. Emily Carter, who had once bounced barefoot through her front yard and made jokes about becoming a teacher, became a name written in fading ink. Janice refused to let that be the end. She photocopied missing posters at her own expense, replacing them every time wind or rain tore them down. She wrote to local newspapers, begging them to keep the story alive, sometimes convincing them to run a small blurb or reminder that Emily was still out there. She saved every letter and clipping in a shoebox beneath her bed, reading them when sleep refused to come. The neighbors eventually stopped bringing over casseroles or offering comfort. Some crossed the street to avoid her eyes. They were tired of the story that would not end the grief that made them feel guilty for moving on with their own lives. Janice noticed their distance and hardened herself against it, telling herself that she did not need their pity or their help if they would not truly try to find her daughter. The Perry house grew even more forbidding as the months passed. Mr. Perry was away, often working construction jobs across Kentucky and southern Indiana, according to neighbors who kept tabs on such things. Mrs. Perry kept the curtains drawn tight, only emerging to tend a patchy vegetable garden in stiff silence, or drive into town with a fixed glare that dared anyone to speak to her. Children whispered about the house being haunted, daring one another to step onto the porch at night. No one stayed long. The place seemed to exhale distrust and fear, a silent monument to the town's failure to protect one of its own. And still the basement door stayed shut, its secrets sealed behind peeling paint and dry-rotted steps. The third summer after Emily vanished arrived heavy with heat and silence on Shive Lane. Lawns browned in the relentless sun, and children who once rode bikes past the Perry house now cut wide circles around it. Janice Carter still walked the street every evening, head down, and eyes scanning for anything out of place, but even she noticed the quiet that had settled like dust over the block. Neighbors spoke in low voices about moving away or changing routes to avoid the weight of seeing that shuttered house. Tension curdled into bitterness, and blame whispered at back fences. The rumor that the Perrys were planning to leave the neighborhood spread quickly, a sour mixture of relief and resentment, as if everyone hoped their departure might somehow cleanse the street of its dark history. No one quite knew when the moving trucks would arrive, but people watched the house carefully, waiting for signs of activity behind the drawn curtains. It happened without warning one humid evening in late August. A battered van with Indiana plates backed quietly into the Perry driveway while dusk thickened into night. Neighbors peered through blinds and from porches as figures moved in and out of the house, with boxes and black garbage bags refusing to acknowledge anyone watching. The air felt electric, with unspoken questions no one dared voice. A few neighbors claimed they heard hammering coming from the basement at 2 a.m, a slow, rhythmic pounding that stopped abruptly when porch lights snapped on. By sunrise, the van was gone, and the Perry house sat dark and silent, its front door padlocked from the outside, with new heavy chains. Children who dared each other to jump the porch found the lock cold and solid, the windows shuttered so tightly that not even slivers of light could escape. Janice woke to find the street strangely quiet. She felt the difference before she even stepped onto her front stoop. The Perry house looked abandoned in a way it never had before, empty of any sign of life. She walked over slowly, pressing her hand against the locked door, as if expecting to feel a heartbeat behind it. She scanned the ground for any clue left in the rush of leaving, but the weeds were trampled in places, and nothing obvious remained, except for a small, dark stain on the porch wood she could not identify. Her chest tightened as she imagined Emily's last moments locked somewhere inside that house while the family packed up their belongings and fled. She turned and walked home slowly, each step an effort to keep herself upright. Rumors spread that the Perrys had filed no forwarding address with the post office. Mail piled up in the box for weeks before someone finally reported it, and when postal workers checked the records, they found only a P.O. box in Evansville, Indiana, registered under a generic family name. Calls to that box went unanswered, and no one in the sheriff's department had the budget or will to send deputies 2 hours away to chase a family that had never officially been charged with a crime. The case remained inactive, its evidence sealed in a battered green file cabinet in the county building, yellowing paper clipped together with handwritten notes that no one bothered to update. The sheriff explained to Janice as gently as he could that there was nothing more they could do without new evidence. Janice did not accept that explanation. She marched to the county office and demanded a new search warrant, but the clerk behind the bulletproof glass barely met her eyes as he handed her a form for filing complaints. She wrote letters to the local paper that were printed buried among advertisements for lost pets and estate sales. She cornered deputies at gas stations and grocery stores, repeating her daughter's name over and over like a curse, daring them to forget what had happened on their watch. They avoided her now, muttering apologies they did not mean as they hurried back to their cruisers. At night, she sat on her porch in a plastic lawn chair facing the Perry house, staring at the dark windows and willing the secrets behind them to reveal themselves. A month after the Perrys left, a sheriff's deputy drove by to check on the property and found the front door chained shut, the windows boarded from the inside. He noted the condition on a report that was filed and quickly forgotten. Neighbors noticed that the mailbox was pried open at some point, the metal bent and twisted like someone had tried to force it. No one saw who did it. The grass grew waist-high around the foundation, and graffiti appeared on the side facing the alley. Ugly words spray-painted in black and red that someone scrubbed away half-heartedly, but never fully removed. Kids began to dare one another to touch the porch at night, but no one tried to get inside. Parents warned them away with nervous eyes, refusing to say what exactly they feared might still linger there. Months passed, then another year. The house became part of the landscape of Shive Lane, a rotting monument to failure and fear. The story of Emily Carter faded from conversation, replaced by new gossip about jobs and marriages and the tragedies of other kinds. But the Carter house remained brightly lit every night, Janice paying the electric bill she could barely afford just to keep the porch light on for a daughter who might somehow find her way home. She walked less now, her joints stiffening with age and grief, but she never stopped watching the house across the street. Even when the windows turned black with grime and the yard choked with weeds, she sat at her window and waited. The years that followed the Perrys' departure felt like an endless gray stretch for Janice Carter. Time lost its shape as each day brought the same view from her front window. She would sit in a sagging armchair for hours, her eyes locked on the decaying house across the street. The boards covering the windows were now warped and discolored, and vines crept over the siding like fingers reclaiming something long dead. She drank bitter coffee that cooled before she could finish it, her mind trapped in loops of memory that refused to let her rest. The street itself quieted in her presence. Neighbors who had once offered casseroles or polite conversation now found reasons to cross the road or shut their doors early, unwilling to meet the flat stare of a woman who had become something of an accusation herself. Janice refused to let the world forget. She scraped together money from a part-time cleaning job and printed fresh flyers every few months, replacing the sun-bleached ones on telephone poles and grocery store bulletin boards. Each new photo felt like an act of defiance against the relentless erosion of memory. She handed them out to strangers at gas stations, to clerks who pasted on sympathetic smiles while inching away. Some people murmured that she was obsessed that she needed to move on for her own health. She ignored them all. Even as her own hair streaked with gray and her hands grew trembly from fatigue, she remained focused on that one unbearable truth. Emily had gone to the Perry house and had never come out. By early spring of 2005, Janice reached a breaking point that surprised even her. For weeks she had watched the old Perry house, noting with growing certainty that no one came or went. The yard was a tangle of brown weeds and the mailbox leaned broken against the post. One drizzly night, she walked slowly across the street, clutching a small crowbar in shaking hands. The padlock on the front door was rusted, the chain sagging against the frame. She pressed her ear to the door and thought she heard something shifting inside, but the sound might have been her own heartbeat crashing in her ears. She set her jaw and pried the lock with more determination than strength surprised when the metal gave way with a protesting squeal. The door swung open on dry hinges, releasing a sour wave of old air that made her cough. She stepped inside carefully, each footfall stirring up the smell of mildew and cold rot. The living room was stripped bare. No furniture left the floor, covered in a fine layer of dust that clung to her shoes. She walked in a slow circle, her flashlight beam cutting through the gloom to show sagging wallpaper and a water-stained ceiling. She called Emily's name, once a raw whisper that barely made it past her lips. She pressed on her eyes, locked on the narrow hall that led to the basement door. She remembered the stories of the dog barking there, of the officers who had been forced to stop searching. Her breath grew shallow. The basement door creaked open when she pushed on it, revealing a darkness that felt nearly solid. She hesitated at the top of the steps, shining her light down into the yawning space below. The beam illuminated warped wooden steps and a patchy concrete floor stained dark in places. She swallowed hard and descended carefully, hand gripping the rickety railing. When her foot touched the basement floor, the smell hit her harder, a foul mix of mold and something older, something like rust. She swung her light across the walls and nearly dropped it when she saw the inside of the door. Deep gouges were carved into the wood, ragged and desperate. Blonde strands of hair caught on a protruding nail glowed pale in her light, like threads of accusation. She pressed a trembling hand over her mouth, fighting the bile rising in her throat. She stumbled back up the stairs, and into the chill night air, gasping like she had broken the surface of deep water. Her legs buckled on the porch, and she sat hard on the rotting boards, the crowbar clattering to the ground beside her. She sat there for what felt like hours, knees pulled to her chest, rocking gently as rain began to fall in cold needles against her hair and clothes. Eventually, the distant wail of sirens grew closer, lights strobing against the overgrown lawn. A neighbor had seen her break in and called the sheriff. Deputies arrived to find her soaked and shivering, unable to speak. They helped her to her feet with stiff compassion and guided her to the cruiser, careful not to meet her eyes as they asked routine questions. At the station, Janice was booked for trespassing, her fingerprints taken on cold glass. She sat in the holding cell alone, the harsh fluorescent light flattening every line in her face, making her look older than her years. She barely reacted when the county social worker sat across from her, with a legal pad and soothing voice asking if she had anyone to call. She did not. She refused the stale sandwich offered hours later, choosing instead to press her forehead to the cool, concrete wall, whispering Emily's name over and over until the sound lost meaning. When she was finally released, she shuffled out of the building into the gray dawn with no one to greet her. In the weeks that followed, Janice was admitted to the local hospital for exhaustion after collapsing in her kitchen. Nurses checked her vitals and spoke in gentle tones meant for someone fragile. They did not ask about Emily, though they recognized her from the news stories and the faded flyers in the waiting room. She lay in a narrow bed, staring at the ceiling tiles, feeling the weight of the old Perry house pressing on her chest, even from miles away. Her discharge papers included referrals for therapy and support groups she would never attend. She returned to her house on Shive Lane, unlocked the door with shaking fingers, and walked straight to the window that faced the Perry property. She lowered herself into her chair and resumed her vigil. The old Perry house sat like a rotting tooth in the mouth of Shive Lane, its windows boarded and walls streaked with dark green mildew. The yard was a wild tangle of weeds and saplings sprouting freely through cracks in the walkway and along the warped foundation. Children no longer dared each other to step onto the porch. Their parents told them to stay away, with urgent voices glancing over their shoulders as if the place might hear them. Neighbors mowed carefully around the property line, unwilling to venture too close to the boundary where the grass grew waist-high. On hot days, the smell of mold and wet rot would drift across the street, making Janice gag as she sat at her window. She refused to close it, though, telling herself that as long as she could see the house, she still had control over the memory of what had been taken from her. Graffiti bloomed on the siding in angry strokes. Someone spray-painted words so obscene they lingered even after half-hearted attempts to scrub them away. Empty beer bottles rolled in the gutter, evidence of teenagers drawn by the house's grim legend. On rainy nights, wind would slam the old shutters against the siding, the sound cracking like gunfire and echoing through the neighborhood. Some claimed they heard crying coming from the basement, thin and hopeless, but no one admitted checking. 2 squatters were found there in 2008, wrapped in musty blankets among piles of trash and old newspapers. When police pulled them out, the men were shaking and refused to explain why they had left in such a hurry. One officer wrote in his report that they kept muttering about hearing someone in the walls. Janice watched this decay with an angry grief that settled in her bones. She wrote letters to the city demanding they do something about the property, but the replies came back curt and dismissive. As long as taxes were paid, there was little the city could do, and taxes were always paid, sent by an anonymous party with a return address in another state. It enraged her to think someone out there was keeping the house just alive enough to avoid foreclosure, maintaining the rot, as if preserving a secret. She took to calling the city code office weekly, her voice cracking as she recited the address like a prayer. The clerks began recognizing her number, their politeness thinning with each conversation. She could hear them typing without interest, promising to send an inspector who never seemed to come. In 2010, a city code inspector finally walked through the house, clipboard in hand. He noted the roof sagging under years of wet leaves, gutters clogged with bird nests and black sludge. He stepped carefully on the porch, testing the rotten boards with his boot before entering the stinking darkness inside. His flashlight cut across a living room strewn with moldy drywall and animal droppings. The air hung damp and unbreathable thick with the smell of slow rot and something metallic. In the basement, he paused, clicking his pen against the clipboard as he examined the back wall. He squinted at a seam in the concrete, tapping it with the handle of his light. The hollow sound it made seemed out of place, but he made no comment in his report beyond writing possible structural concern. He backed out quickly, nose wrinkled, checking it off the list before stepping outside to breathe. Janice was waiting across the street, clutching her arms against her chest, watching him leave without a word. She called the office the next day and was told the inspection was complete, that repairs would be recommended, but no further action was planned. She slammed down the phone so hard it cracked the cord, jerking out of the wall. Her breathing was ragged as she stared out at the house, tears blurring her vision. She wiped them away with shaking hands, pressing her forehead to the cool glass of the window. She thought she could almost hear Emily's voice high, and panicked, calling for her from the basement that no one would truly search. The thought made her stomach twist until she was sick in the sink. Neighbors tried to keep their distance, but gossip found its way around. Some said Janice had finally lost her mind, that she sat for hours talking to the empty house like it would answer her back. Others felt pity, but did not act on it, telling themselves it was not their place. The Perry house became part of the neighborhood's uneasy landscape, like the old oak that split in storms but refused to fall. It was there in every whispered warning to children not to wander off, in every shiver that ran through adults who walked past at dusk. Yet no one tried to change anything. It was easier to pretend the decay was natural, that its cause lay in weather and neglect, rather than something darker rotting in the foundation. For Janice, it was different. The house was alive with memory and suspicion, a constant wound she would not let scar over. She kept her own property spotless, her lawn trimmed with rigid precision, the windows washed so nothing would blur her view. She sat every evening in her chair by the front window, a figure locked in stubborn vigil. She would not allow the world to forget. She would not let the house fade into ruin quietly. The thought that her daughter had once been inside it filled her with a shaking fury that replaced sleep and meals and human connection. She did not notice how thin she grew or how gray her hair turned. She only noticed the house watching her in return. By early spring of 2011, the city had finally tired of the constant complaints and the looming liability that the Perry house had become. Heavy rains that year battered the sagging roof until water dripped steadily into the walls, warping floorboards and turning old insulation to gray mush. Mold bloomed in black streaks that crawled around window frames like spreading bruises. The front porch sagged in the middle, threatening to collapse under its own weight. The city posted a bright orange condemnation notice on the weathered door, the paper flapping in wet wind as if trying to escape. Janice stood across the street that morning, watching them nail it in place, her arms folded tight against her chest. She read the words over and over, the letters swimming through tears she refused to let fall. Contractors hired by the city began to survey the property, marking the yard with neon flags and spray paint in bright colors that looked garish against the weeds and mud. They wore plastic boot covers and masks as they crept through the damp, foul-smelling rooms, taking photos for their reports. One contractor kicked aside an old rotted board on the porch and startled a nest of mice that scattered in all directions. He cursed under his breath, wiping sweat from his brow despite the chill. When they descended into the basement, they paused at a corner where the concrete looked oddly discolored and cracked the surface soft enough to crumble when pressed with a boot. They made a note in their ledger that the foundation required special care during demolition. Janice watched all of it from her window with hawk-like focus. Eyes narrowed against the morning sun. She called the city office every day, demanding they hold off, her voice growing shriller with each conversation. She tried to explain about the police dogs years ago, about the smell, the gouges in the door, the hair she had found. The clerk on the other end listened with polite exhaustion before repeating that the condemnation was final. She paced her living room, muttering Emily's name like a prayer, her fingers tracing the outline of old photos taped to the wall. At night, she barely slept watching the contractor's trucks parked in front of the house, headlights shining through the wet mist as they left late engines rumbling like distant thunder. A letter arrived at City Hall that week with no return address, typed in stiff, legal language on heavy white paper. It demanded the city refrain from any excavation on the property during demolition, citing property rights and potential environmental hazards. The language was formal and intimidating enough to give the city attorney pause, and he called a hurried meeting with the building inspector and planning director. They sat in a fluorescent-lit room reading the letter aloud in low, tense voices, none of them sure who had sent it. No records showed the Perrys in the area, but their ownership remained on file. The taxes had been paid again that February, as always, the check drawn on an out-of-state bank. The letter was tucked into the property file with a paperclip, a bureaucratic artifact of unease no one wanted to address. The city decided to proceed anyway, citing safety concerns that outweighed any private objection. They scheduled the demolition for August, notifying surrounding property owners with formal letters that used words like abatement and nuisance mitigation. Janice received hers on a Friday afternoon. She crumpled it in shaking hands, sinking to the floor beside the couch as her chest heaved. She pressed the letter to her forehead and rocked slowly, keening under her breath. That night she sat in her front yard in a plastic chair staring at the Perry house. The condemnation notice glowing orange in the streetlight. She stayed there until dawn painted the world a sickly pale, daring anyone to try and move her. When the demolition company dropped off the bulldozer a week before the scheduled teardown, the neighborhood turned out to watch. Kids pointed and whispered while parents pulled them back by the arms. The driver maneuvered the massive machine onto the cracked driveway with practiced ease, shutting it off and climbing down to wipe his hands on his jeans. He said nothing as he locked the cab, tossing a glance at Janice, who stood on her own lawn, with her arms folded so tightly her knuckles were white. She wanted to scream at him, to throw rocks, to do anything that would make them understand what they were about to destroy. Instead, she turned on her heel and went inside, slamming the door so hard the glass rattled. In the following days, contractors cordoned off the yard with caution tape and orange barriers. They walked the property with clipboards marking hazardous spots in red paint while shaking their heads at the rotting structure. The local newspaper sent a photographer who snapped pictures of the condemned house from 3 angles, publishing them on the front page above a headline about city cleanup efforts. Janice clipped the article and pinned it to the wall beside Emily's photo, drawing a shaking X over the picture of the house. She called the paper the next day, her voice cracked with fury, but the editor offered only mumbled sympathy before hanging up. By mid-August, the tension on Shive Lane felt physical, like a taut wire ready to snap. The bulldozer sat silent in the driveway, an orange beast waiting for the signal to move. The grass was dead from the weight of its treads. The air smelled of diesel and rotting leaves. Neighbors avoided the street when they could, cutting through alleys or driving the long way around to bypass the spectacle. Those who did venture close did not make eye contact with Janice. She stood guard on her porch every day, watching city trucks come and go, her face a mask carved from grief and anger. She would not let them forget what they were about to erase forever. The morning of August 15th dawned heavy with clouds, the air thick and still, as if the weather itself was holding its breath. The city crew arrived just after sunrise, their trucks rumbling to a stop along Shive Lane. Men in safety vests hopped out, stretching stiff backs before unloading equipment and unspooling bright yellow caution tape. The bulldozer operator stood beside his machine, sipping cheap coffee, glancing at the condemned house without expression. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains or stood on porches with arms folded, unwilling participants in a show they had waited years to see. Janice had not slept that night, her eyes red and swollen as she sat on her porch in an old lawn chair, clutching a framed photo of Emily so tightly her fingers left prints in the glass. When the foreman shouted orders to clear the perimeter, Janice did not move. She rose slowly, as if her joints might betray her, and walked across the narrow street with measured steps. She reached the sagging porch of the Perry house and climbed onto it with effort, ignoring the groaning boards beneath her weight. She dropped heavily onto the top step, the framed photo in her lap, and wrapped a thick chain around the splintered railing. The padlock clicked shut with finality, echoing louder than any voice in the sudden hush. The crew stared in confusion, shifting from foot to foot. The foreman removed his hard hat and ran a hand through thinning hair, glancing back at the city official who had come to oversee the demolition. Janice began to shout, her voice cracked and raw, but clear enough to carry down the block. She held Emily's photo aloft with shaking arms, screaming that her daughter was in there, that they could not bury her twice. Her words tumbled over themselves in ragged sobs, but she refused to stop. She listed every failure, every dismissed report, every time someone had told her to move on. The foreman approached cautiously, trying to talk over her, but she ignored him completely. The photo pressed to her heart, as if it could shield her from the world. Her breath rattled in her chest, but she drew more, shouting until her voice broke entirely. Police were called as the crowd grew. A few neighbors drifted closer, drawn despite themselves to the spectacle they had tried so long to avoid. Some turned away, guilt twisting in their stomachs at the sight of Janice chained to the rotting porch, refusing to budge even as her knees trembled with fatigue. The first officers on scene spoke softly at first, trying to persuade her. They used calm words and gentle tones, but Janice only tightened her grip on the chain, her eyes bright with feverish determination. She pointed at the basement window at the boards that barely held in the frame, demanding they look inside before they destroyed the last place Emily might have been. More police arrived, sirens wailing briefly before cutting off lights flashing against damp pavement. A city lawyer hastily summoned from an early breakfast meeting arrived in rumpled clothes carrying a folder he never opened. He spoke to the officers in low, urgent tones, glancing repeatedly at Janice, who had fallen silent, rocking back and forth on the step with Emily's photo clutched to her chest. Cameras from the local news vans captured it all, their crews scrambling to set up tripods and thrust microphones at anyone in a uniform. The scene transformed from quiet tragedy to public crisis in minutes. As reporters asked questions no one wanted to answer, the city official tried to regain control, his voice rising over the chatter. He insisted they had the legal authority to proceed, that the building was condemned and dangerous. But when officers moved toward Janice, the crowd stirred uneasily, some shouting for them to leave her alone. A woman in curlers wept openly, clutching her young son to her side. The tension grew electric and uncertain, like a storm about to break. The police paused, exchanging uneasy looks, unwilling to be the ones seen dragging a grieving mother away in front of rolling cameras. Seeing the spectacle unfolding, the city attorney pulled the foreman aside and spoke quickly, gesturing at the reporters and the growing crowd. The foreman nodded reluctantly and ordered his crew to stand down for the day. The bulldozer operator climbed back into his cab, but did not start the engine, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel while he waited for word. Janice sat frozen on the porch, tears streaming down her face, unchecked, her hair plastered to her cheeks in the damp air. She did not move or speak, simply rocked slowly with the photo pressed to her chest, whispering to Emily in words too soft to hear. By noon, the street was clogged with city vehicles, news vans, and clusters of neighbors who would not admit they were there to watch. Reporters spoke to the cameras in practiced tones, relaying the story of a mother who refused to let her daughter be forgotten. They highlighted her chain, the condemnation order flapping in the wind, the bulldozer idling behind her like a patient monster. City officials held a brief press conference on the other side of the street, announcing they would temporarily pause demolition to review concerns raised by the family. No one mentioned Janice by name, referring to her only as the mother of a missing child. Late in the afternoon, Janice finally allowed herself to be unchained, her limbs stiff and trembling with exhaustion. Police helped her stand, gently guiding her back to her own porch as she sagged against them. Emily's photo never left her hands. She did not look at the crowd or the cameras, keeping her eyes on the ground, as if the weight of all those watching was too much to bear. She sat in her chair as the city crew packed up their gear in silence, the caution tape fluttering in a gentle breeze that carried the promise of rain. A week after Janice's protest stopped the bulldozers cold, the city reluctantly agreed to a forensic team examining the property. They arrived early on a cloudless morning, unmarked vans pulling to a stop with a hiss of brakes on cracked pavement. Men and women in blue windbreakers stamped with county seals unloaded equipment carefully, their faces tight with grim purpose. The street fell quiet as neighbors peeked from windows or watched from porches, unwilling to admit their curiosity. Janice sat unmoving in her lawn chair, Emily's photograph balanced on her knees. She refused water or food, eyes fixed on the condemned house with unblinking intensity. The caution tape fluttered in the breeze, casting shifting shadows across the dead grass. Inside, the forensic team set up portable lights that banished the deep gloom of the decaying rooms. The floors creaked under their boots, giving way in places to spongy rot. They worked methodically, photographing every wall, every stain, every scrap of forgotten trash. The basement door loomed at the end of the narrow hall, like a mouth about to swallow them whole. When they pushed it open, the smell that rushed out turned even seasoned officers pale. It was the heavy stink of wet mold, and something older, metallic and foul, seeping from the walls like a memory that refused to die. They descended carefully, boots scuffing on warped steps, flashlights cutting sharp cones through the sour darkness. One investigator knelt at the corner of the basement where contractors had reported the soft concrete. He ran gloved fingers over the cracked surface, pressing until it crumbled like stale bread. He called quietly for ground-penetrating radar, and the team wheeled the bulky device over the uneven floor, adjusting dials and reading screens with practiced frowns. The machine pulsed its signals into the earth, revealing hidden contours beneath the concrete. Lines lit up on the display in unnatural shapes, boxes too precise to be rock or rubble. The investigator tapped the screen twice, his voice low but firm. He ordered the team to prepare for careful excavation. They chipped away the concrete slowly with handheld tools, collecting every fragment in plastic evidence bags. Dust choked the air, hanging in lazy beams of light that made the workers cough and wipe sweat from their brows. As the layer thinned, the outlines of a metal box emerged, its rusted edges breaking through the gray crust. The room fell silent, except for the scrape of metal on concrete. One investigator signaled to a photographer who crouched low, capturing every angle before anyone dared move it. With gloved hands, they lifted the box from its shallow grave and set it gently on a cleared space against the wall. The air felt colder somehow, as if the truth inside had sucked the warmth from the room. They opened the box, slowly, hinges squealing in protest. Inside, neatly folded clothing lay undisturbed small shirts and a pair of denim shorts faded from age. Nestled among them was a thin silver necklace with a tiny heart-shaped charm, the metal dull but recognizable. One investigator closed his eyes, exhaling shakily as he described the contents into a recorder. He paused to steady his voice before adding that the clothes matched descriptions from missing person reports. They bagged each item, carefully labeling them with dates and times their gloves stained with dust and crumbling fabric. The box itself was photographed from all sides before being sealed in evidence wrap. As the team prepared to carry it out, another investigator swept the area with his light and noticed a second anomaly in the dirt. It was smaller but distinct, a shape that should not have been there. They scraped at it carefully, revealing another metal box, this one pitted with rust so deep it flaked off at a touch. They repeated their process with mechanical precision, even as dread thickened the air. When the lid cracked open, a stack of Polaroid photographs lay inside their edges, curled from moisture, but the images sickeningly clear. Each showed the same girl, her hair tangled, and eyes wide with fear, tied at wrists and ankles gagged with a rag. The background was unmistakable, the same rough basement walls and single bare bulb overhead. The lead investigator swallowed hard, gesturing for the forensic photographer. Flashes lit the room in harsh staccato, freezing the nightmare in forensic clarity. Outside, news vans had returned, their satellite dishes pointed skyward as reporters spoke into cameras with hushed urgency. Word spread quickly that something had been found, drawing more neighbors who stood in clumps on lawns, hands over mouths, eyes wet with horror. Janice watched from her chair, her knuckles white around the photograph of Emily. She did not speak, did not move, but tears carved silent tracks down her lined cheeks. When the evidence boxes were carried out covered in black plastic, the street fell silent. Even the birds seemed to hush. Officers guided the team carefully to the waiting vans, reporters straining against barricades to catch glimpses. The sheriff arrived, hat in hand, face drawn and pale as he watched the boxes being loaded. He approached Janice slowly, but she did not look at him. She sat unmoving, Emily's photo pressed to her chest, her shoulders shaking with sobs that she refused to let become sound. The sheriff stood there a moment before turning away his eyes, wet his voice low as he ordered the crowd to clear. After the boxes were unearthed from the Perry basement, the investigation shifted from a cold case everyone wanted to forget to the center of public outrage that refused to be ignored. The photographs became grim evidence that seared itself into the conscience of Bowling Green. They were shown behind closed doors to officers and prosecutors who sat in stunned silence, the images leaving no room for doubt. A forensic team worked around the clock, cataloging every detail. Fiber analysis matched Emily's hair found in the basement door years before, with strands caught on the nail. The clothing carried traces of soil that suggested she had been moved and buried somewhere else. The case file, once gathering dust on a forgotten shelf, expanded with affidavits and lab reports until it filled a banker's box of its own. In the sheriff's office, men who had once shrugged at Janice Carter's desperate pleas spoke in hushed tones about what they had missed and what they would never forgive themselves for ignoring. News of the discovery spread beyond the county, picked up by statewide papers and local television stations that ran somber segments in between sports scores and weather forecasts. Reporters lingered at the site even after the boards were pried from the windows and the basement was sealed off with police tape. They caught images of Janice standing on her porch, frail and unmoving, clutching Emily's photograph like a talisman. She refused all interviews. Her eyes remained fixed on the house that had swallowed her daughter 12 years before. Neighbors who had once avoided her gaze now sent casseroles and cards that piled on her stoop, gestures that felt hollow even to the senders. The silence on Shive Lane was heavy with guilt and sorrow, broken only by the idling engines of news vans that cast their bright lights on peeling paint and blackened mold. Detectives and federal agents pored over old records following the paper trail that had always led to the Perrys. Property tax receipts had been mailed from an address in Flagstaff, Arizona, where the family had registered under new names and lived in a modest stucco house with carefully tended roses out front. They had no criminal record in Arizona, and neighbors described them as quiet, private, polite, in a way that discouraged questions. When the warrant came down, U.S. Marshals arrived at dawn, knocking hard enough to rattle the thin windows. Mr. Perry answered the door in a bathrobe, blinking in confusion that turned quickly to understanding. He did not fight. He raised his hands slowly, watching the agents with the dead eyes of someone who had prepared for this moment for years. His wife stood behind him, clutching a robe at her neck, her mouth a tight line as she watched them cuff him and read his rights. He was flown back to Kentucky in a transport plane surrounded by men who avoided small talk. In the sheriff's department booking room, his mugshot was taken under the harsh glare of fluorescent lights that bleached his skin to sickly gray. He sat at a metal table in an interrogation room that smelled of disinfectant and stale coffee, his hands shackled to a bolt in the floor. Detectives read from files, laying photographs in front of him one at a time. He flinched at the Polaroids turning his head, but did not speak until they threatened to charge his wife as an accessory. Then he talked in a monotone that made the hairs on the back of their necks rise. He explained how he had lured Emily inside with a lie about her mother being sick and needing help, how he had locked her in the basement behind a false wall he constructed himself over several days, how she had cried and begged until he could not stand the noise anymore and drugged her to keep her quiet. He said he had planned to let her go, but neighbors got suspicious after the police visit, so he moved her in the dead of night to a rented property outside Scottsville. He buried her in a shallow grave he dug with his own hands. He told them it had been raining that night, and the mud stuck to his boots, details that no one had prompted him to share. He spoke with a flatness that left the room silent, except for the hum of the air conditioning. Investigators drove out to the property he named a parcel of overgrown field that had been rented in cash years before. Under a gray November sky, they used shovels to clear the tangled weeds and sank markers into the soft earth where ground-penetrating radar detected anomalies. They found her in what remained of a blue plastic tarp bones arranged in the same fetal curl in which he had placed her. Her small sneakers lay beside her skull. The rubber hardened and cracked with age. They photographed everything from a distance, afraid to disturb even the angle of her limbs. When they carried her remains away in a simple box, the men on the team removed their hats and bowed their heads. No one spoke. Back in Bowling Green, news of the arrest spread like a fever. Parents clutched their children closer and turned off the TV when reports played during dinner. Churches held vigils with candles flickering in cold wind, the names of the lost read aloud in somber procession. At Emily's old school, teachers led a moment of silence, some wiping tears from their eyes, as they remembered the laughing girl who had drawn rainbows on every spare sheet of paper. Janice planned the funeral with numb precision, selecting a simple headstone with Emily's full name and dates that hurt to carve in stone. On the day of the service, the church overflowed with people who had once crossed the street to avoid her. She sat in the front row, back rigid Emily's photo in her lap one last time. When the casket was lowered into the ground, Janice did not cry. Her tears had dried years before, leaving only a hollow ache she carried like an extra rib in her chest. She rested a hand on the polished wood and spoke quietly words that only the wind and the trees heard. She walked away without looking back, shoulders hunched against the gray sky. Later that week, she listed her house for sale. The porch light finally burned out, the curtains drawn. The listing agent did not ask why she wanted to leave. She moved to another town where no one knew her name, carrying only a box of Emily's belongings and a small tin of ashes. The Perry house was razed to its foundation, the basement filled in with clean dirt hauled in by dump trucks that rumbled through the narrow street. Grass grew over the plot in patchy tufts, trying to erase what had stood there. Children who passed by on bikes did not know the story, but their parents did, glancing uneasily at the empty lot and urging them to hurry home before dusk. In City Hall, the file was finally marked closed, locked away in an archive drawer with a note in bold red ink indicating the resolution. But for Janice, there was no resolution that mattered. She carried the loss in her ribs and spine, in the tremor of her hands, in the dreams that woke her in the night. If you found this story compelling, make sure to like and subscribe for more true crime-inspired narratives. Let us know in the comments what you think about this case and where you are watching from. Your thoughts help keep these stories alive and the conversation going.